recording. So welcome everyone to this first class on Yeshe Sundru's, the essential nectar. So as usual, we're going to start with a few prayers. I'll introduce the text and all of that after we've done some prayers and a little meditation. So we're going to begin with the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. And I think for this course, just because I want to make sure I have plenty of time to talk about the text, we're just going to recite this one time rather than three times. But we're bringing to mind all the qualities, the realizations that the Buddha has, and admiring those, but also thinking about the fact that we and all beings can attain this same state of development. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And then we'll do a mandala offering. This is again kind of symbolic of our making a vast pure offering to receive the blessings of our gurus, all the holy beings, so we can actualize these teachings in our minds. So we'll do this together in English. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And think that the holy beings have received all of what we've offered, this vast pure offering, and can think that a shower of blessings kind of descends down upon you. Lastly, we'll do the Refuge and Bodhicitta verse, which, as usual, we're going to do the first time in English. So we kind of bring these words to mind of taking refuge in the three jewels and then generating the motivation of bodhicitta. And then we'll do it twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam yi drola penchir sangye drupar sho sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gipe sanam yi drola penchir sangye drupar sho. And as I said, we'll just do a short meditation. As usual, we're just going to spend a few minutes focusing on the breath, just to calm the mind a bit, let go of whatever distractions we might have from our day. So you can work with the breath whatever way you prefer. Tune into whatever sensation of the breath, or if you want to count the breaths, whatever it is, it helps you to calm your own mind. We'll do this in silence for the first few minutes, and then I'll come in and I'll lead you in a short reflection to kind of strengthen our bodhicitta motivation for tonight's class. Okay, so we can begin the meditation now. So, when setting our motivation for tonight, I'm going to start with this very simple fact that was the beginning point for everything that the Buddha taught. And this observation that every single being, just like ourselves, simply wants to be happy, doesn't want to suffer. And even though we have that fundamental urge, desire to attain these things, to find real happiness, to be rid of our suffering, we haven't yet achieved that. And what we're going to be studying in this course is the Buddha's path to happiness and to complete freedom from suffering and all that obscures our minds. The Buddha's observation is that we simply have been going about trying to achieve this goal in ways that are contrary to how it is actually accomplished. And from the wisdom mind of the Buddha, these teachings are kind of presented to us as the means to accomplish our own welfare, but moreover, to achieve the state of Buddhahood, where we can then help others in the same way that the Buddha and other enlightened beings are helping us. So the entire path that we are going to be examining over these sessions focuses on this idea that we have the opportunity to develop ourselves completely, to attain our ultimate welfare. But we do this with the main aim of being able to help all beings achieve that same state. So set your motivation to that very, very vast and profound scope, to think that you're here not just for your own welfare, though that is included, but in order to help all sentient beings perfectly. By becoming a Buddha, we then can accomplish that. And try to hold this very deeply in your heart, this motivation, so that everything that we do tonight becomes a cause for achieving that result. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. Wonderful. So again, welcome everyone to this first class. I was so happy that it all worked out for me to be able to do this class for all of you. The last class I did back in last year in the fall was really enjoyable as well, but I'm kind of looking forward to this. I've taught this text one time before. Actually, I'm still kind of towards the tail end of teaching it. Of course, I've taught on the Lamrim many times, but this is a really wonderful text that actually probably was mentioned in the little blurb for this course. One of Rinpoche's kind of texts that he recommended frequently to people. They would come to him and say, Rinpoche, what advice do you have for my study and meditation on the Lamrim? And he would encourage people to pursue this text. So I do want to talk a bit about the text in advance and go through some details on it so that you're familiar with the way that this text is sort of put together, a little bit about the author of the text. So there are very scant details about his life, but nonetheless, I'll share what I have. So I put together some slides to kind of get us into the material a bit and see what happens from there, but we'll definitely get into the text tonight. So this is the main text that we are going to be using. I certainly would encourage you to obtain the book. I think at Wisdom Publications right now, it's around $22 for the hard copy, but I think it's like $10 for the uh, e-file of it. So you could, have it for just $10 essentially on your tablet or whatever computer. It's a book that goes back many, many years. I actually purchased a copy way back when I first was starting to study at our center in San Francisco in the mid 90s. But it was republished, I don't know, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago by Wisdom. And it has some commentary by Geshe, oh, it should say Rabtin, not Rabin. Sorry, I'll correct that later. Geshe Rabtin was one of Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe's teachers. And so it's some very precious commentary from him. Some of that I'll bring in on occasion. The translation for this is done by Martin Wilson. I might mention to you that The way that this text is put together, it's versified. And so there are Tibetan verses that have been translated into English in our text that we're going to be using. And I've supplied Colleen with a PDF of just the verses that come from that book. Martin tried to keep it in verse form, and there are some times where that's a little awkward. So I would also recommend that if you would like, and you can obtain this as a free PDF download, to use an older translation that was done by Geshe Losang Tarchen, together with a couple of his students, I assume. It was translated there as the essence of nectar rather than essential nectar through the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. I will send along to Colleen tonight after the class the link for where you can download that as a PDF file. I've downloaded it from there, and it doesn't have, as far as I can tell, there are no problems with that, no bugs in the system or what have you. But I'll even show you a little bit of what that text looks like. Let me just give you an idea, because again, in that text, they didn't go for the versified form. Instead, what they did is they kind of made it much more of a text that you would read, like with paragraphs and what have you. You'll see, from our text that these are all set into verses. So one of the topics that we'll hopefully get to tonight, relying upon our spiritual guide, you see that it's just written in paragraphs and what have you. Whereas if we go to the text that we're going to be using, it's all set out in verses. And the problem with using the other one, which I do like, is that it doesn't have verse numbers. So it's much easier in our text to work with the verse numbers. There are essentially, I think, a total of 425 verses in this text. We've got about 12 sessions to go through them. So obviously, I'm going to have to kind of skip through some things a little bit quickly at times. In this course, we're going to be doing kind of an overview of the Lamrim. Lamrim is this wonderful genre of Tibetan teachings, Lam meaning path, and Rim meaning kind of stages or graded. The idea being that it is a way of progressing through everything that the Buddha taught very sequentially as a means of becoming familiar with and meditating on and realizing everything the Buddha taught that will support us all the way on our path to enlightenment. It's often called the Jangchub Lamrim, the graded path to enlightenment, Jangchub. This is actually one of what are called the 18 great texts in the Lamrim tradition. Some of them are really quite brief. Some of you may have studied texts. I think I've taught on one text by Lama Tsongkhapa called The Three Principal Aspects of the Path. There's another one by Lama Tsongkhapa called The Foundation of All Good Qualities. Those are like 14 verses, each of those. What we have is kind of something in the middle. Lama Tsongkhapa also wrote the largest treatise on the Lamrim, the Great Treatise, which is huge. It's published in English in 3 volumes, and there's like 5 books that are commentaries on that by Geshe Sopa. But the idea is that we can study Lamrim in a variety of ways. This text is used to study the Lamrim to some degree, but it's also used as a meditation tool. And one of the other documents that I'm going to send along to Colleen is a file that was put together by Tom Trudy, who used to be in our education department. And it is a way of working with the main meditations in this text on kind of a daily basis. So you can, for example, for the first point that you might want to meditate on, you'll go through that first section, advantages of devotion or reliance upon a spiritual friend. And you see that there are verses indicated for that, numbered verses. And so it goes all the way through all the topics that we're going to be studying that are in the Lamrim, all the way up to the final chapter or portion on Tantra, which is the 92nd of these different sections. So you could kind of make this a round of meditation that you do, working with these verses. Every 92 days, you would start over again. I mean, it's just different ways of using this text, and maybe we'll talk about that more as we go through it. But it is definitely a sort of meditation manual. Now, again, because it's quite compact in places with these verses, it's not giving you all the information behind them. My role in this, survey of these verses is to try to provide what information is needed, but it'll still be on a somewhat limited basis, obviously, because we can't go into detail on every aspect of it given the time that we have. But nonetheless, hopefully, those of you who are familiar with the Lamrim, it'll give you a new tool to use in your practice and study and meditation on the Lamrim. Those of you who are new to the Lamrim, it's a good enough overview of the entire path to enlightenment to be able to then go and do deeper investigation through some of the other texts. Maybe I'll also share with Colleen, there is a page at FPMT's website with a whole list of all the various Lamrim texts that are translated into English that can be used. There certainly are other programs of study that go into much more detail on the Lamrim. The Lamrim is again, it is based on the Buddha's teachings and encompasses the Buddha's teachings, but it is a Tibetan creation to some degree, but not created solely through Tibetan masters because it goes back to about 1,000 years ago when a wonderful Indian teacher, Lama Atisha was invited to Tibet, and he made the arduous journey from India into Tibet and lived there for a number of years in order to be able to bring the Buddha's teachings in their entirety to the Tibetan people. Of course, the Tibetans had the Buddha Dharma there for some centuries before, but they were really in need of something that was much more practical, that gave them exactly how to take all of these teachings and apply them in their lives. And for Western minds, I think the Lamrim is an amazing tool because it really does work with kind of putting everything in direct order. We could even say that the way that the Lamrim is structured, which we're going to go into in a moment, is kind of like our education system, where we start off with the very basics of learning. You learn your mathematics and your English and all the various things that give you the tools that you can work with. Then you go on to a more advanced study in high school and what have you, and even more advanced study in university and graduate school. I mean, there's a gradation in learning that is happening with the Lamrim that is really a wonderful structure. And so I hope you come to appreciate it even more through this examination in this text. This is the author of our text. Again, as I said, there isn't much on him at the Jangchub Lamrim website, which is a site that has all of these various texts, the 18 Lamrim texts. They talk a little bit about him, but again, you can certainly look that up. He lived from 1761 to 1816. So he's about midway between when Lama Tsongkhapa, who was again one of the teachers who explained and wrote extensively on the Lamrim that Lama Atisha brought back again around 1,000 years ago. So he's about midway between Lama Tsongkhapa and our modern masters and people who are still continuing to keep the Lamrim tradition alive. He wrote about 10 books, I believe, 10 treatises, and he was accomplished in terms of his own practice and meditation. Uh, Again, not many other details in terms of him. He was ordained at a pretty young age, but accomplished quite a bit in the years that he did live. So again, this is just a little bit about the author. In terms of Lama Atisha's structure of this, which again, he's basing it entirely on the Buddha's teachings, but providing this graded structure, it goes back to his text that he wrote in Tibet for the Tibetan people called Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. And in the very beginning of that, I didn't share verse 1, but this is verses 2 through 5, he explains right off the bat what are the different levels of progress that we are going to go through. And he says in this first verse that I'm going to share with you, understand that there are three kinds of persons because of their small, middling, and supreme capacities. I shall write clearly, distinguishing their individual characteristics. So again, just as we might say that when we look at someone who's in grade school, elementary school, someone who's in high school, who's in university level studies, they have different capacities, right? I mean, you have that rare student who is like entering college at, 7 years old or something, but that's pretty rare, pretty unusual. Most of us have to go through a sort of developing our capabilities. We develop the capabilities that help us to go from elementary school to high school, from high school to university, even maybe from university to graduate school, what have you. If you had a child that you wanted to, go through all of that process at 5 years old, you wouldn't take them to a graduate school and say, here, this is what I really want you to accomplish, have at it, because the child is not going to be capable. So this is very much about capability. And Rinpoche, even when he would teach on this, he called these the least capable being, the middling capable being, and the great capable being. So this is what we're going to be examining in terms of the structure of the Lamrim. There are a few additional topics that kind of work around those, but those are the main kind of divisions of this path, this graded path to enlightenment. And I know some of you have heard some of these teachings before, but I just thought I would review some of this so that we kind of all get on the same page. So, verse 3 goes on to talk about the lowest of these three, the least capable. Know that those who, by whatever means, seek for themselves no more than the pleasures of cyclic existence are persons of the least capacity. Now, in some texts, they even divide this into two beings. One who is really just preoccupied with the pleasures of this life, which they say isn't even a Dharma practitioner. I mean, this is what most beings are doing in this world. This is what animals are doing in this world, is simply trying to eke out some measure of happiness and pleasure in this very life. They're not thinking beyond this life. In Buddhism, of course, it's taught that there is a continuity of our consciousness, our mind, beyond this life. So, this first level is where we at least have a concern with what comes after this life. It's still a preoccupation with worldly existence, with what we call samsara, with gaining good rebirths within samsara, a rebirth like this human life where we have things relatively well. Again, not every human being has the same conditions, but we have also an intellect that we can use in this life in order to investigate the teachings and progress in our spiritual practice. So we have this wonderful opportunity in this life to create the causes for our next life, or at least, maybe even beyond the next life into future lives. And that's the main teachings that we're going to talk about first after we get the sort of preliminary teachings is, well, how do we affect that change? Having a motivation to at least get a good rebirth. Admittedly, it's still just the pleasures of cyclic existence of samsara, but it will give us the tools to be able to continue our spiritual development because admittedly it is somewhat difficult to achieve it all in a single lifetime. So the second level of progress that we make is where we start looking at the bigger picture. This is the person of the middling capacity. Those who seek peace for themselves alone, turning away from worldly pleasures and avoiding destructive actions, are said to be of middling capacity. This is where we look at the bigger picture of that, samsara, the round of existence that we continue to go through life after life. There's that phrase, been there, done that. Well, we've been there, done that since beginningless time. We have been engaged in samsara under the control of our karma and afflictions going from life to life. The level of motivation for this person and the capability they seek to attain is to be wanting to be free of that, wanting to not just get a good rebirth because you'll still be in samsara, but to attain nirvana, the peace that comes when we have removed the causes of this cycling going from life to life. So that's a much more advanced level. But the first two levels are still very much about our own situation. And the Buddha taught these methods for achieving, something that will be a good rebirth as well as this freedom from samsara. But the Buddha also taught a path where we go beyond that. That's even what we were meditating on tonight with this mind of bodhicitta. This is the third level of the stages of the path. Those who, through their personal suffering, truly want to end completely all the suffering of others are persons of supreme capacity. It's kind of interesting phrasing in that first line, right? Through their personal suffering, meaning the personal endurance and trying to overcome all of what obscures our minds. It takes great effort. It's a very arduous task to do this. But this is the motivation of this person of the greatest capacity, is that they see that there is the potential through their own enduring, the changing of our minds, the removal of all these obscurations, they can actually attain a state of Buddhahood, going beyond just our own liberation and achieving a state where we can help others. We'll talk more about this idea of Buddhahood and what the Buddha is in some of the future classes, those of you who aren't as familiar with that concept. But the idea is that every one of us has the potential to do that. We have what we call Buddha nature. Buddha nature is sort of the seed from which our full development, our full evolution into the state of Buddhahood can occur. So we see that these levels of motivation advance greatly. The first two being really just about our own situation, initially about future lives. The second one being about attaining our own individual liberation, our own kind of personal nirvana. And then the third one, where we go beyond those goals to achieve the complete fulfillment of our potential, to accomplish Buddhahood on the basis of our Buddha nature. And this is a much more difficult task. It's a heavier burden that we're carrying and does involve a lot more kind of lifetimes of work to accomplish this. Nonetheless, as we'll see at the very end of this, there is the tantric path that can allow you, with the proper conditions, to achieve that state much more quickly so that you can benefit sentient beings much more quickly. So this is the idea behind these three levels. We're going to see them coming up and gain an appreciation for all the teachings that are taught within each of these levels to increase our capacity. And we're going to do all these teachings with the greatest motivation, of course. Every time we get together, we'll meditate on bodhicitta and developing that kind of mind directed towards achieving the greatest goal. But admittedly, most of us are probably still much further down on our own spiritual development. That's okay. It's all a gradual path, and we shouldn't squeeze ourselves and think that, we have to accomplish it all in this moment. Rather, just keep getting familiar with the teachings, meditating on them, incorporating them into your life, and eventually the results will come about. So this is the structure for what we're going to be looking at in this text, as well as all the Lamrim texts have the same sort of structure. One thing I want to touch on that isn't in our verses, that is just a nice way of getting us into the ballpark of the Lamrim as well, is to talk about what are called the four greatnesses of the Lamrim. And these four are spoken to at the beginning of most Lamrim texts because they give us a deep appreciation for what is encompassed in them and how they kind of work perfectly with regard to our own practice. The first is the greatness of realizing that all the teachings the Buddha gave are non-contradictory. One of the things that they say about the Buddha in terms of his teachings, he taught for about 45 years. Oops, I'm sorry, that wasn't supposed to do that. I was wanting to click on the stop share. He taught for about 45 years, and they say he taught differently to different people at different times. And sometimes people would think, oh, that's not a good teacher at all. They should be saying the same thing and the final word to everyone that they teach to. But this is showing the skill that the Buddha has in being able to give teachings exactly in accord with the minds of the beings who were present. And so it might look like the teachings are contradictory if we take them in that, just literal way, that at this time he's teaching this and then he's contradicting himself by saying something different here, and then it sounds even more different in this other, part of the Buddha's teachings, the other sutras. Well, the reason for that is because the Buddha was teaching according to the level of development, the predispositions of the people who were present. So it looks contradictory, but it is all maintained within the Lamrim that shows how these teachings actually make sense. Because at the level of being the small or the least capable being, the small level of the path, you can then see the applicability of those teachings. And then you can see how maybe they're not quite in the same light when you get to the next level. And then they become a little different when you get to the top level. Everything kind of changes because your perspective changes based on your own learning. The Lam helps us to see that there's no contradiction between these teachings, that they are set out exactly in accord with the Buddha's insight into how it is best to work with them. The second one is the greatness of all the Buddha's speech then appearing as instruction. And by this we mean personal instruction, where we do think, we have to incorporate everything the Buddha said in its essence, in the very kind of the kernel of it, what it really is referring to, as personal advice for us. This is also one of the wonderful things that we see in studying a text like this, is how there is that applicability of every teaching to our own spiritual practice. The third is the greatness of easily discovering the conqueror's thought. Even though the Buddha did teach in this kind of seemingly or superficially contradictory way, he did arrive at some final teachings that are the final thought of the Buddha. By saying the conqueror's thought, the Buddha's thought, that's what we're aiming for, is we have to eventually get to that most profound level of teaching that the Buddha gave, which we can then incorporate into our minds because we will have developed ourselves in this process. but this is a way to get to them. You can't, again, just like I said, you can't take a child at 5 years old and put them in graduate school and expect that they're going to be successful because they don't have the ability to understand the profound subjects that are taught at a master's degree level or whatever of a subject when they haven't even learned how to, add two and two or something. That's just not going to work, right? It's very similar for us. We need a path that will prepare us to be able to discern the final intent of the Buddha, teachings that, again, are needed in order to attain the most profound results. The fourth one is an interesting one, the greatness of the automatic cessation of what is called here great misconduct, kind of one of the worst things it said that we can do in our sort of Dharma career is if we kind of turn away from or even brush aside some of the teachings of the Buddha as if, oh, well, those don't matter and those aren't relevant and you might as well just get rid of them in a sense. The Buddha taught everything with a purpose. The Buddha never said anything that was superfluous or, you know, an aside or something. Everything has great meaning because of the way the Lamrim is structured, including all of these topics. It kind of immediately allows you to not have the fault of abandoning any of the Dharma, any of the teachings that the Buddha gave, because it incorporates all of those into this wonderful structure. So these are four things that, again, give us an appreciation for what is being accomplished in these teachings. One thing I might say is if you were to actually go back to all the sutras the Buddha taught, well, first of all, good luck even finding them in English. I mean, you'd probably have to, learn Tibetan or Sanskrit or Chinese or something to go through even just the Mahayana scriptures, much less the Pali canon, that many other Buddhist traditions follow. The idea is that the Lamrim kind of brings all of that down to its essence. And of course, the text that we have is called the Essence of Nectar or Essential Nectar because it's bringing all the main points of that down to a more even essential point. But this is the real value of this type of study is that we're not missing anything. It's encompassing everything the Buddha taught, giving it to us as personal advice, personal instruction that we need to practice and helping us to avoid any errors or faults, any flaws in our thinking as we go through our development spiritually. So it's a really, really wonderful text, the whole schema of Lamrim in terms of when I first met the Lamrim, I thought, wow, this is really important to kind of work with. And I'll share some quotes from you maybe later from Rinpoche and where he emphasizes the importance of this. One other very short, very brief thing that I want to go through that helps us to prepare our minds to engage in these teachings is to cultivate what are called the six recognitions to become a suitable vessel for receiving these teachings. They often talk about the Buddha teaching things, especially his initial teaching on the Four Noble Truths, where he's kind of pointing out to us that we are sort of sick people. As it says here, recognize yourself as a sick person, as someone who is actually ill. And we could say, in a sense, we are mentally ill. We have defilements and misunderstandings and misconceptions in our own minds that we need to be rid of through the Dharma that the Buddha gave, which, as it says in the second one, we need to recognize as the medicine to help us to relieve our illness, to cure our illness. Now it says here, recognizing the teacher as a skillful doctor. That doesn't necessarily mean me. I'm hoping that what I share lives up to that kind of idea. But certainly we can see Yeshe Sundar, the author of this text, as well as Lama Atisha, who devised the structure of the Lamrim, as well as, of course, the Buddha and all the other beings that have supported this as being kind of doctors giving us skillful advice in the manner of these teachings that, again, have been summarized through the Lamrim as very practical means of taking the medicine. But it's helpful to have that kind of perspective that we are putting our trust and confidence in somebody who actually knows this path, who can give us that medicine for us to be able to take and to effect the cure. And that's the fourth point. Recognize that practice, study, meditation is the way to be cured. Just receiving these teachings and kind of writing them all down and having the text and even kind of having some understanding of them without integrating them into our minds is only going to go so far. We do have to meditate on these topics. We do have to practice. That's the way we change our minds. And we'll talk about that more as we go through the Lamrim. The fifth is recognizing the Buddha as holy and reliable. This kind of keeps you in that space of being able to receive the blessings of the Buddha, the inspiration from the Buddha, so that it becomes a powerful means of accomplishing the realizations of these topics. And then recognizing that the Dharma should flourish and endure. We come to see our own kind of value in the Dharma that then allows us to maintain that in our perspective as something that cannot disappear from this world, that we want to endure, that we want to have others adopt and what have you, so that it flourishes in our world. Now, that doesn't mean that we become proselytizers of Buddhism and we go door to door and say, "Hello, can I talk to you about the Buddha for a while? Can I leave a Lamrim book with you or something?" That's not what we do in Buddhism, right? We don't proselytize or try to get other people to practice the Dharma. It's seen as kind of, we are here, and as people have the karma to find us, to be involved in us, well, then that's their doorway, and we try to make it as easy for others to follow as possible. But if the Dharma isn't there for them to find and for them to study and practice, well, then it's going to be pointless. They might have a desire to do that, but we need to have the Dharma intact. We need to make sure it continues to abide in this world. It's such a valuable jewel. It's quite amazing when we look at, even in our lifetimes, most of us, who, when we were growing up, maybe Buddhism existed to some degree in our country, very small pockets perhaps of Zen practitioners or other practitioners. But like Tibetan Buddhism in particular, this was almost unknown for a good share of most of our lives. And then when the exile from Tibet happened with the Dalai Lama and so many other teachers, Lama Yeshe, Lama Zopa, the founders of our organization, it's quite amazing how the Dharma has exploded in our world. It's there in such a rich way for so many people to access in so many different languages. So the Dharma is more available than it ever has been in our world. We want to keep that thought of it being available and dedicate our own practice to the Dharma always being accessible for beings to find this path that, again, we develop some confidence in ourselves. Many of us already have that great confidence, but hopefully in the study of this, you will gain even further confidence in the Buddha's teachings. So that's enough of a kind of getting us into preliminary thoughts around this study. What I'd like to do is just jump right into the text. This is the general structure for the text. There's an homage to begin with that gives a sort of setup for the author's way of paying respect at the very beginning of the text. And there's a conclusion that is kind of a few additional verses that he composed. In between are, again, 425 verses. I am going to do a very cursory explanation of this first part, what is called the preparatory practices, because it's 96 verses and there's a lot within it, but it's meant to be kind of conducted as a preliminary practice. Then we get into the actual practice, which will encompass the first section, which are what we call here the basics, which includes the two topic of devoting to our spiritual guides, relying upon them, and recognizing this opportune human rebirth that we have. Then we go into the three scopes that I mentioned just a short while ago, these three levels: the path of the inferior person, the person of least capacity, the intermediate person of middling capacity, and then the superior person of great capacity. So this is the basic structure that I'll go back to again and again, just to keep us kind of grounded in where we are in this text. So let's go ahead and pull up the text, and let me see if there are any questions. Were there any questions on that introduction? Did everyone kind of follow it? I know I talked a little quickly there, but no questions? Okay, then let's go ahead and start working with the text. As I said, there may be times when I use the other text, the other version, but mainly I will be working with the one that you've been sent, which again is this translation by Martin Wilson. So this is the verse of homage that it starts with. To my glorious holy root guru and those of his lineage, combining in one all the conquerors of the three times, I prostrate and go for refuge. May they look after me inseparably in all my future lives. So this is a topic that we'll hopefully get to by before the conclusion of today, which is the idea of devoting ourselves to our gurus and trying to have the best view of our gurus, to try to ideally see our gurus as inseparable from all of the other Buddhas, and this, in essence, an enlightened being themselves. So it's very common to pay homage to one's gurus at the beginning of a text like this, because that is the kind of linkage to the teachings. We recognize that we don't have any, and again, I'm not anyone who's written a text, but anyone who is writing a text would recognize that they only have what they can share due to the kindness of their gurus and due to the kindness of all the Buddhas that preceded them and all the lineage masters who have transmitted these teachings in this unbroken chain of beings. And we want to have that kind of respect and homage for them because of the role that they play. So it's very common to see this at the beginning of one of these Mahayana texts in particular. So this is how our teacher starts, and or our author starts, and there's nothing kind of that unusual about that in some ways. Then he says, in just a little aside here, here I shall describe concisely in verse how fortunate, tameable beings may practice the profound instructions on the stages of the path to enlightenment. So he is saying kind of what he is doing, his intention in this text, which again is somewhat unique. As far as I know, there are no other texts that are this long that go into verse form that present the stages of the path. And he's presenting it for fortunate, tameable beings, those whose minds actually can be tamed by the Dharma. So you'll notice that there is that first section that I mentioned, the preparatory practices. Again, this is 97 verses, and I'm not going to go through all of those verses with you tonight or even next week. I think they're something you can sort of read on your own. Let's instead take a look at what is the contents of those verses. When we talk about these preparatory practices, it's usually mentioned that there are six. Now, what is a preparatory practice? It means something we do in advance of the actual practice, but these are also practice. These are also things that are important. Like if you were going to have someone come to your home and kind of be there for a while, you would want to do a lot of things to prepare for that, right? And some of these practices are even in that vein of kind of creating a welcoming space and a beautiful kind of environment for them to be invited into. And so that's the idea behind this, and to prepare our own minds to sort of receive these guests. So the very first two, there aren't any verses pertaining to them specifically. They involve kind of making the room where we are going to do practice, what we might call our gompa, our place of meditation in Tibetan, and kind of making sure that we are creating that welcoming space through cleaning it first and through also arranging our altar. Again, I'm not going to go into all the specifics on this. I'm guessing many of you have had teachings on these topics. If you haven't, let me know, of course, and I can try to supply you with information that will help elaborate on this. The second one is we want to obtain offerings honestly and arrange them beautifully. Now, again, if you were going to have somebody come into your house and stay for a while, it'd be nice to kind of set out some beautiful things for them, some candles and flowers and some food, things that are very welcoming, put on some nice music for them. These are the nature of the sorts of offerings that we want to make. And there are the water bowl offerings that many of you do that on your altars that represent those various offering substances. We want to obtain those honestly, not through any deceit. You don't go to your neighbor's yard and just start chopping down their roses and flowers to put them on your altar. If you want to take them, please ask. Don't just, take them without permission, because that's not a very good way to obtain your offerings. You obtain them honestly and you arrange them beautifully. If you do have some form of an altar, I've got my altar here behind me, then you try to enhance the beauty of your altar with all of these wonderful offerings in as good a quality as you can make them. This again is just these first two steps are about having this clean, beautiful, welcoming space for the Buddhas, in a sense, that you're going to be inviting into that space to help you with your meditation. So these are mainly the things that we do prior to sitting in meditation. And ideally, we should do them at the beginning of our day. Then we see that the remaining four practices, other than the fourth one there, it's got really not some separate verses. We kind of use a similar visualization. We have the remaining practices that do have verses connected with them. The very next one, number 3, sitting in meditation posture. Again, I'm not going to go through the instruction of like the 7-point posture. Know that that's out there. Most of you hopefully have some instruction already in meditation posture. And then we visualize the refuge field, meaning kind of bringing those beings, the Buddha and whatever other beings we're visualizing, into our awareness, into our meditation space. And so that at the very beginning of this, verses 1 through 8, we go through all the various things that set out the visualization of the refuge field. And I'm just going to, the very beginning here, go through a couple of verses. I doubt that I'll do this as we go through each of these steps, but just to show you how this kind of plays that role. First, the stage of refuge. And so it's not indicated separately here, but we have the first 8 verses where we are visualizing this refuge field, this kind of domain of beings that we're bringing forward into our awareness that we are visualizing in the space before us. Before me, amidst a cloud sea of wondrous offerings, upon a throne which 8 mighty and powerful lions uphold, precious and very wide, on a lotus flower in great discs of sun and moon, is my root guru, who shows the unerring path, indivisible from the Lord, the King of sages. That means the Buddha Shakyamuni, the Buddha of this era, shining like the peak of a golden mountain, with the marks and signs glory and clad in the 3 monks' robes. Again, there's a lot of terms perhaps in here that you might not be as familiar with. It's okay, but you just bring to mind as best as you can the Buddha visualized in the space before you. And as was said, you think that this is inseparable from your guru, which we already saw in the homage. And again, we're going to see it in the very first topic of the topics of the Lamrim that we'll go through beginning tonight. So there's that step. And as I'm just going to go again through the summary of this so that you have an awareness of where these are. And by the way, these slides I'll be making available to Colleen as well, who will kindly send them out to you so you have them. After you visualize the refuge field, there's a generating the minds of refuge, this mind of finding protection in the 3 jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, this that you're visualizing and kind of embedded within this Buddha that you are visualizing. And then, of course, generating the mind of bodhicitta, which would include what are called the 4 immeasurable thoughts, immeasurable love, immeasurable compassion, immeasurable joy, and immeasurable equanimity. And those are set out. That's a rather extensive section from 20 to 35 where we meditate on those minds. But this is our third preparatory practice, is that we actually have to kind of sit down and steer our mind in the right direction. Kind of like what we did tonight. We recited that little verse that had to do with refuge and bodhicitta, which are the 2 main thoughts that are being, encompassed in that third step. We generate a thought of finding this safe direction in the Buddha and especially the Dharma, the Buddha's teachings, as well as the Sangha that support us on our path. And we generate a motivation of bodhicitta. And you use the 4 immeasurable thoughts as a means to kind of moisten your mind, because bodhicitta is rooted especially in compassion and love for beings. And of course, with an equanimity that embraces all of them as with equal regard, in regard to those minds of compassion and love. So again, I'm not going to go through all those specifically just because of the duration of this text and the amount of time I want to spend more on the actual topics of the Lamrim. But know that you could actually even use these verses again as your practice daily if you would like to. It's 97 verses, so it will take a while to go through them. But nonetheless, they're a tool that can be used in fulfilling all these preparatory practices. Begin by setting up your room and doing the offerings, and then sit in meditation posture. Read verses 1 through 8 to visualize. Read 9 through 19 to generate the mind of refuge. There's even, I think, a refuge verse at the end of that. And then bodhicitta, which would include, the 4 immeasurable thoughts. The fourth step in the preliminary practices usually is visualizing what we call the merit field. In some practices, the refuge field, that we use for the previous prayers and or not necessarily prayers, but at least generating these minds, sometimes that it dissolves, and then we have what we call a merit field. But in this text, we use our refuge visualization. So there isn't a separate set of verses for the merit field. We just hold on to the awareness of what we visualized in verses 1 through 8, and we carry on with the practice. So the next practice would be what's called offering the 7-limb prayer. The 7-limb prayer, most of you are familiar with these 7 limbs. I'm just going to mention them briefly because, again, that would end up taking a lot of time to go through them more extensively. We start with the limb of prostration, where we can put our hands together, tucking in our thumbs so that they make kind of a little offering inside our folded hands, our prayer hands. And we put this at our heart and we can visualize making prostrations to the merit field, the refuge field. The second one is offerings. So the offerings we've arranged, as well as any offerings that we want to bring to mind, we can offer them mentally to the Buddhas, to, again, the merit field. The third one is the limb of confession, or kind of trying to remove our negative actions, the karma that we've created through the force of our deluded minds. And there is a whole process for doing that, but it's kind of calling upon the Buddhas not to purify those for us, but to be a support for our own purification, our own confession and removal of those faults. The fourth of these 7 limbs is the limb of rejoicing, where in confession we look at what we've done that's negative, and rejoicing we look at what we've done that's positive, as well as what others have done that is positive, and generate this mind of great joy, thinking about how wonderful beings, it is for beings to engage in virtue and doing, acts of generosity and kindness, and our teachers teaching the Dharma and all the various things that are going on that are trying to affect a positive change in our world, and all the qualities that beings have that are the product of those kinds of activities and thoughts. And of course, to look at ourselves and really rejoice, as I said earlier, in our own good deeds, the things that we do with our day that are worth taking some notice of. They say that when you rejoice, you multiply the merit that you've created and you get a share of the merit that others have created on the basis of their virtuous deeds. The fifth and sixth are sometimes in different orders, so you might see them in a reverse order than the way I present them. Usually what I see is for the fifth is to request the Buddhas to remain first. And that's because we have to create the causes from our side to experience the Buddhas in our lives, to have these beings, our gurus and what have you, be a part of our lives. So we make this strong prayer for them to remain, for them to continue to abide in this world. Then in the sixth one, we make a request for them to turn the wheel of Dharma, as we say, to continue to teach the Dharma. It's kind of an extension of that thought that I mentioned earlier. That's one of the 6 kind of recognitions that we need to have, that we want the Dharma to remain in this world. Well, therefore, we want our teachers to continue to teach it, and the Buddhas to continue to disseminate the Dharma. And so, okay. So then the seventh is what we call the limb of dedication. Dedication is where all the positive energy that we've created, we seal, we kind of make sure that it is protected and will bring forth the result that we seek, which of course is the complete enlightenment of all beings through our own attaining that state. So that's a very brief overview of the 7 limbs, and you'll notice them in that section. Again, I don't have the verses in front of me, but it's verses 36 through 70. And again, if you need a more detailed description of each of those, you can find them in many of the Lamrim texts. The last one, sometimes offering a mandala is included in the 5th step, but in many presentations, it's included in the last. What is a mandala? A mandala is essentially a way of depicting the entire phenomenal universe. And they have a sort of template for doing that that's based on the traditional Buddhist teachings on cosmology. But in our own minds, we can just simply think about the world that we experience, this entire phenomenal world, just being transformed into a beautiful paradise. Whatever it is that comes to mind for you when you think of that, kind of a pure land, a wonderful, um, kind of maturation of things to the greatest degree so that it's no longer contaminated, that things don't fade. Everything we're visualizing is in that state in a lasting, enduring way. And we're making this vast, pure offerings to the Buddha, to our gurus. We did this in the prayer that we did at the beginning of class tonight. I didn't give maybe as much description, but there are many different ways of doing the mandala. You can do it with something that symbolizes the various levels that are set out in the traditional cosmology. But the main thing here is to feel like you're giving a vast, pure offering. And then on the basis of that, the last step, put it on the screen now, is to make requests. If you have somebody very important that comes to visit you, take advantage of them being there. Say, and now that you're here, I would really like to ask you, please help me. Please inspire me. Please give me what I need in order to accomplish this path. The Buddhas want nothing more than to help you. So we have to create requests from our own side. And this is a very powerful part of the practice. It's quite a few verses, 72 through 96. But if you do this as a daily practice, it kind of instills in your mind this real wish to generate these realizations and to beseech the Buddhas and the Gurus to kind of help us to accomplish that. Because this is what we do again prior to, as preparation for, sitting in meditation on the topics of the Lamrim. So almost every practice to some degree has these elements. They might be missing one here or there, but essentially we have all six of those that we should ideally do before we sit down and engage in a meditation practice. Now, again, we probably don't have time. Most of us are quite busy to do that every single day, but maybe on the weekends when you have more time or whenever your day is off, you could actually, engage in a much more methodical practice where you're bringing all of these elements into your um, time that you're going to dedicate for that. So it's important, again, to be familiar with these. In the beginning of Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, for example, there's quite a detailed explanation of every one of these six preparatory practices. But they create a very fertile ground upon which realizations can grow. Lama Tsongkhapa, it said that his guru appeared to him in the form of this Buddha that we call Manjushri. Manjushri is the Buddha of wisdom. And so he was getting teachings from this amazing sort of light being that was appearing to him. It may be hard for us to believe all these things, but this is how Buddhas can appear to us when we've purified our minds more. He essentially asked Manjushri, what is the quickest way to achieve enlightenment and to have realizations of these topics? And of course, he says you do have to, of course, meditate on the path. This is true, right? That's the main part of our practice, is that we sit down and the teachings we're going to go through, class by class by class, are what we need to meditate on. We need to bring them to mind with the various examples and analogies and various things that help us to increase our understanding of them through our own reasoning and investigation and so on. But he said that's not all, of course. We need two other things. One is putting together these two activities of accumulating merit and purifying negativities. It's kind of like, again, if we're creating this ground upon which realizations are going to grow, we need to make sure that the soil is free of any impediments, kind of purify the soil. You try to grow things in a garden where there's lots of rocks and weeds and other things, it's not going to be so fruitful. You first have to get all the junk out of there so that the soil is capable of supporting, some sort of growth. But then you also have to enhance the soil. That's the accumulation of merit. Otherwise, things aren't going to grow quite as well in it. So those two tasks are included in this second thing that Manjushri said. He said you need to engage in extensive purification and accumulation of merit. And even Lama Tsongkhapa himself, who, when you read his texts, he's unbelievable in his scholarship and his understanding. But he had to engage in millions of prostrations and millions of mandala offerings and all of these things in order to have the realizations he gained. So why do we think we're exceptions to that? We should instead be very dedicated to at least engaging in these in our practices, because the seven limb practice, many of them are about accumulating merit and purifying negativities and so on. But the third one is quite interesting. It's that last of the preparatory practices. He says you need to also make single pointed requests to your gurus. to seek their blessings. Again, Buddhas cannot enlighten us from their side, one side only. There's that wonderful phrase from one of the sutras where it says, Buddhas do not enlighten beings, or the Buddhas do not relieve suffering in the way that you would take a thorn out of a hand. Buddhas do not um, um, remove negativities in the way that you would remove dirt from a cloth. And Buddhas do not create realizations through taking their realizations and planting them in the minds of sentient beings. How do the Buddhas help us? By giving us the Dharma, by teaching the Dharma, and most especially teaching that final intent, the most profound teaching that the Buddha gave. But of course, we need everything that precedes that so we can be suitable vessels for attaining those levels of realization. So just putting that out there that, we are driving to achieving this first one, really doing deep meditation on the Lamrim, using these verses, using our own understanding, reading, studying, and develop eventually realizations. But to do that, it's not just, okay, I'm going to sit down and meditate on it. I also have to be concerned about accumulating merit, purifying negativities, and making these heartfelt requests to our gurus. They're there as a support. We need to use them in that capacity. So those again are just a little bit about preliminary practices, preparatory practices. Let me see if there are questions on that before I start digging into the main dish, the main topic for tonight. Anything? I'm hoping that most of you have encountered these teachings before in your other study. Again, the Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand is a text I point out frequently simply because many of you have studied Discovering Buddhism or other classes where that's been one of the main sources of understanding the Lamrim. But admittedly, some of what's in that, because it was Tawanka Rinpoche, this great Tibetan master in the 1920s, teaching to an audience of monks in Tibet, it's a little obscure at times and hard for us to get our heads around. But there, as I said, I'll make sure that you are pointed in the direction of obtaining any other Lamrim resources that you need. They're very extensive, such as the great treatise I mentioned earlier by Tsongkhapa, and then they can actually be quite brief. There are a few texts written by His Holiness that are really just overviews of the path to enlightenment that are really quite useful. Again, I'm guessing many of you have already some of that study. So let's go to the text. Actually, let's go back to our outline and get kind of grounded in that again. After the preparatory practices, as I said, comes the actual practice. And we're going to go first into the basics. The basics includes two main topics. Here, we're calling it guru devotion. That's a bit of a loaded word, devotion. The idea is that we need to have a proper way of relying upon our gurus, those beings who are in our lives in a very close way that can influence us on our spiritual path. And then the second topic is to look at the opportune, fortunate rebirth as a human that we currently possess. They often talk about this first one, the guru, being like the outer condition. We have something outside of ourselves that is helpful in our spiritual practice and even essential in our spiritual practice. But we also, from our side, through our own actions, have created this human life that is fortunate, that does have great opportunity. So these are the two topics we're going to look at in the basics that will help us to have the foundation for wanting to use this life well, then wanting to use this particular, having met the Dharma through our gurus and having this good rebirth, that we actually take advantage of that opportunity, make good use of this life. Okay, so the advantages of devotion and the disadvantages of not being devoted are going to be talked about first. This is what I often call Buddhist advertising. If you do guru devotion, these are the things that you'll get, and if you don't do it, you're going to miss out, and these are the things that will happen to you. Then we're going to talk a bit about how to devote ourselves in terms of thought. Again, I'm using the titles that come from our text. So this word devote, it means how to rely properly on our gurus in terms of the thoughts that we have towards them. And we'll go into that in more detail. And then even how do we devote ourselves, rely upon the gurus correctly in terms of our actions. Okay. So we see that we're going to first go through this section that has the advantages of devotion. And we'll go to that now and then go on to the disadvantages if we don't properly rely upon our gurus. So I'm going to have to jump forward in our text quite a bit here. So don't get dizzy. Go all the way to 97. Oh, I might just read this little bit before we get into the verses. It says here, this is kind of at the very end of the requests, which was the last of the preliminary practices or preparatory practices. He says, making requests like this, one practices also the stages of visualization of opening the door of the supreme path and requesting many inspirations according to the oral instructions. Then one either absorbs the field of accumulation, the field of merit, as given in the Delam, or not, as given in the oral precepts of Manjushri. These are two of the other Lamrim texts, as one wishes. Again, Lamrim text by first Panchen Lama and then the fifth Dalai Lama, respectively. So when you do that, generally, I think it's best to do the second, to kind of keep the visualization of the field of merit in front of you as you meditate on these topics, whatever verses you are working with. Again, we have that little schema that not there that I'll show you periodically that kind of gives what we are going to be potentially meditating on over the next week. I'm sure we'll get through the advantages, maybe even some more of the sections in this Guru Devotion chapter, that we will be able to meditate on some of these verses, bringing them to mind, reflecting on them. Okay. So the very first part, we have kind of an introductory verse that is getting us into the topic. It says here, proper adherence with thought and action to one's holy spiritual friend, one's guru, who demonstrates the whole supreme unerring path to Bodhi, Buddhahood, has benefits which are inconceivable. Now, again, the benefits themselves we say are inconceivable. Nonetheless, we do enumerate 8 advantages to having correct devotion or correct reliance upon the Guru. That starts in verse 98 with the first one, which is that you will become kind of closer to Buddhahood. You will move closer to achieving that goal. 97 says, proper adherence with thought and action to one's, oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. I want to go to 98. 98 is where it starts, with hundreds of efforts for oceans of countless eons, great unification, which means the state of Buddhahood, the unification of our compassion and wisdom. In Tantra, it's called the illusory body and the clear light. Anyway, with this great unification of these things into the final result, with hundreds of efforts, it's difficult to find. It's hard to find, but it's taught that if one relies on one's guru's power, it's easy to win it in one short life of degenerate times. Of course, this is in the context of Tantra. And in the context of Tantra, we rely very deeply upon our gurus because our gurus initiate us into tantric practice and are seen as one of the main supports for our practice of Tantra. Now, why is this so? Why is this benefit there? I'm not going to go into that with all of these, but I think it's important to talk a little bit about this. What we say is because of the role the gurus play in our spiritual development, they become the most powerful object of our actions. Right now, we're looking at the benefits of proper reliance. So when we have actions that are done in relation to our gurus, they are the supreme object. Because again, they are seen as the Buddhas incarnate, in an embodied form in this world. And we'll talk about that in the next section when we talk about reliance upon them in terms of our thought and the rationale for that understanding and that thinking. But for now, just know that this is because the gurus play such a prominent role in our spiritual development. They become the supreme object for us. Again, other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, these other beings who are on their path to enlightenment, they're also pretty high objects, but the Guru is the highest, is the supreme object. The karma, the actions we engage in relation to our Gurus, therefore, becomes extremely powerful. How do we do that? Through following their advice. If you have a guru and they say, that you should do these particular practices or you should devote yourself to doing meditation on this particular topic or whatever, that we take that to heart and we follow that advice as if we were just being given the most precious thing in the world. We just want to make sure we fulfill that also through making offerings to them. And it doesn't have to be necessarily just making physical offerings or what have you, but that is one way that we can accomplish that, supporting the projects that our gurus are involved in. But material offerings are also useful, certainly, to create that karma. And also, of course, being of service to our gurus. We're going to talk about some of these ways that we devote ourselves in our action. But the main way is following the advice, right? I mean, what do the gurus want of us? They don't want our material possessions and our service necessarily. They want us to achieve realizations. They want us to become Buddhas. It's the only reason for the gurus to exist. That's what we want to become when we become enlightened, is a source of that knowledge and wisdom to disseminate it to others so they can incorporate it in their minds and achieve the same state. So this is how we become closer to Buddhahood, is because the gurus are such powerful objects for us. Then it says in verse 99, this is, and 99 to 100, by the way, these two verses, the second benefit, which is you will delight the Buddhas. When one correctly adheres to one's holy guru, the thought that one will quickly be freed from samsara deeply gladdens the minds of all the conquerors, like mothers who see their children will succeed. When, as disciple, one rightly adheres to one's guru, the conquerors happily enter the guru's body even without invitation, accept all one's offerings, and also inspire one's mind stream, it is taught. So, whether you think that the gurus are Buddhas or not, you can still begin with thinking that they are sort of the emissary of the Buddhas. They are there as the representative of the Buddhas. And so when we please the gurus by doing things that are in line with their wishes for us and so on, it's like we're pleasing all the gurus because they represent the gurus, or I'm sorry, all the Buddhas, because they represent all the Buddhas. But ideally, we want to see them as one. We want to see them as inseparable. So in that way, whenever we are doing actions that kind of please or go along with the wishes and advice of our gurus, we are pleasing all the Buddhas. We are going along with what they wish for us. So it becomes very powerful again because it's not just the gurus as the supreme object, but we are using them as a conduit in a sense to be able to create the merit of offering to all the Buddhas. So this is another great benefit, is that we will delight these, enlightened beings who are seen again as the same essence as our gurus. Oops, did I go too far? Yeah, no, 101 now is the next one. This is two of the benefits that we see. Usually it's the third and the fifth, but that's okay. We don't need to necessarily have the numbers. And it says in 101, then through the inspiration of all the Buddhas, entering by the opening of faithful mind, one is unharmed by hosts of maras. Maras are kind of inner demons, our own inner states of mind, as well as outer interfering forces, and kleshas, our own afflictions. And secondly, insights to the paths and stages instantly grow and develop. So we see that the third one that is in here in that first part is that we won't be harmed by these external forces, by any sorts of demonic things that we have in our own minds or that are outside of us, and any bad friends or anything else that will be upsetting to us. And that's because we start moving our mind in a direction where those interfering forces don't have much ground, because we are dedicating ourselves to Dharma practice through the advice of our gurus. The second one that's in there is we will have insights to these paths that lead us in the stages of development that will, instantly grow and develop. We'll be able to accomplish realizations of the path, and those will increase greatly in our own minds. So that's the four of these benefits so far. Verse 102 has another benefit. You will easily cease all delusions and faulty deeds. Here in the verse, it says, if one always relies on them, it should say, again, they tend to use the male pronoun here in this translation that goes back to, I think, the 80s or something. So if one always relies on them, our gurus, with devotion, misdeeds and defilements all cease of themselves, and positive traits spontaneously develop. So one finds extensive happiness here and after. So again, the idea here is that we easily cease all of our faults because we're properly relying on our gurus. They're giving us the advice we need, the teachings we need, and we're meditating on them, practicing them, and following them. So of course, our misdeeds are going to diminish. Verse 103, this is the benefit of not lacking a guru in all our lives, which is kind of a karma similar to what we are creating in this life. By the fruit, like the cause of duly pleasing one's guru in this life, in every later life, one will encounter excellent spiritual friends, and hear the holy doctrine, complete and without mistake. Again, we haven't talked about karma yet. That's what's kind of interesting about the Lamrim. Sometimes later topics are brought into earlier topics. One of the most powerful results of our karma is that the actions we engage in, the sorts of things that we do in this life, create the causes to have similar results in the future life. So if we devote ourselves correctly to the gurus in this life, we will have gurus that we can devote to in future lives. Makes sense. That's how karma works, right? So this is again something that's just being reiterated as a benefit of proper reliance, of correct devotion to the guru. Then in this final verse, we have another, what is it, that are the two benefits that are set out. In short, by guru devotion, one temporally finds good birth as a human or god, free of the unleisures. In other words, we won't end up in unfortunate states such as an animal and so on. And then ultimately, a more ultimate benefit, all samsara's sorrow exhausted, one will win the holy state of definite goodness. This term definite goodness is referring to the more ultimate states that are in the second two levels of the path to enlightenment. Remember, the first one had to do with getting a good rebirth. That's the temporal result that we just saw. We get a good rebirth from our devotion to the gurus in a correct way, so that we avoid any unfortunate states. But then we have these other two results of our own liberation and enlightenment that are called here definite goodness. Definite goodness means that they are more certain in that once we attain them, we don't degenerate from them. When you attain liberation, you never resort back into a contaminated state where you're back in samsara again. You attain that freedom, and that freedom is yours for eternity. You attain Buddhahood, and that is yours for eternity. So those are definite goodness, certain in being kind of beneficial for us and for our ability to help others. Those are the benefits. Let me see if I've got time. Yeah, I've got some time. I think I can get through at least the disadvantages as well. There are 8 of those too. Again, as I said, this is kind of Buddhist advertising in Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. These are actually set out after the topic of Guru devotion. But some of the topics of the Lamrim have the benefits and disadvantages at the beginning, some at the end. Here in Yeshe Sondra's text, we're seeing them at the beginning. So now we have an introductory verse like we did in the previous section for the disadvantages of not being devoted or not properly relying upon a guru. It says, thus the advantages of proper devotion to one's spiritual friend are inconceivable. Likewise, wrong devotion and lack of devotion have inconceivable disadvantages too. The guru is a powerful object. So just as we can create incredible benefits in relation to the guru, we can also have great detriment if our reliance isn't done well and properly. So verse 106 speaks to the first of these disadvantages, that if we criticize our guru, we in effect are criticizing all the Buddhas, right? Because of that we saw earlier with the benefits. The guru is kind of the embodiment of all the Buddhas, or at least the emissary of all the Buddhas. So anything we do in relation to the guru is kind of directed towards all of the enlightened beings, all the Buddhas. So it says here in verse 106, it's taught that in one's own guru appears the work of all the spiritual friends and conquerors. Disrespect to them is thus disrespect to all Buddhas. What could have heavier karmic fruition than that? And I don't need to say much more on that. We want to make sure that we have a proper reliance, that we aren't criticizing our gurus or in any way saying negative things about them or negative thoughts about them even. 107 has the second detriment or disadvantage. Each moment of anger that we might have toward our gurus becomes very heavy because of the heaviness of that object of the guru. So many moments of anger towards one guru, he says, so many eons collected, virtues destroyed. So our collected virtues will be destroyed for as many eons as the moments of anger that we have towards our gurus. Those moments, says the Kala Chakra Tantra, mean the same number of eons rebirth in hell. So we're destroying our merit when we get angry at our gurus, and moreover, we are also going to potentially have a very unfortunate rebirth. Again, I'm not trying to freak people out right at the beginning of this text. We will talk about some of these things that we do have to instill in us some level of fear or trepidation. We often talk about how in our kind of uh, ways of motivating people, there's the carrot and the stick, right? The carrot is kind of the nice thing that you get if you do well and kind of abide by things. And then there's the stick that they use to kind of keep things in line when the carrot perhaps isn't working. There's lots of carrot approaches we're going to see in our the Lamrim, but occasionally there's the stick. And the stick isn't meant to be seen as something like, horrible and inflict all kinds of fear in us. The idea is that it's supposed to give us some guidelines about how we make sure that we don't veer off the path into behaviors and attitudes that are only going to cause us more obstacles and more difficulties. And we see it as kind of a wholesome fear, kind of in the same way that if you go to your doctor and your doctor has done all your blood work and he points out to you, or she points out to you, whoever, that you've got, certain things you need to address. If you don't get your cholesterol down, if you don't, work on this or that, you might experience some ill effects from all of that. Well, you take it to heart then, right? It's not like you freak out and go home and are depressed for a year, because you've got this horrible news of your cholesterol being high. You say, okay, this was great advice. This really helps me to know how to have a better effect on my health. And now I can take that advice, change my diet, do more exercise, whatever, and I'll have a better outcome. That's the way that we're meant to see these things. So I just want to point that out because we will see it in a number of these sections where the Buddha and the stages of the path in these teachings is giving us some things we need to be forewarned about. The third one, that even though we practice Tantra, which again, it can be the very quick path to get you enlightened in a single lifetime, you won't achieve that supreme goal. So verse 108 says, if one has done grievous sins, like the five immediate, which are these five sins, two of them are killing your father or mother, one is killing an arhat, a being who has removed all of their afflictions and is in that kind of having a mental nirvana. Um, and then the last two are inflicting pain or drawing blood from a Buddha, and the final one causing a schism in the Sangha. Anyway, those are pretty serious, grave misdeeds. But even those can be kind of removed as obstacles and accomplish the goal by relying on Tantra. So it says by relying on Tantra, nonetheless, the goal can still be reached in this life, even if you've done those five immediate actions of, or sometimes they're called actions of immediate retribution, or just immediate actions. However, one who has heartfelt contempt for their master, it's taught, though they practice for eons, can win no attainment at all. It's kind of like, this becomes a major obstacle to us if we aren't devoting ourselves properly to those beings that we've developed that relationship with. And I will talk about that more next week. What does it really mean to have a guru? What are we looking for in a guru, and so on? So now we get to verse 109 that teaches a fourth one, that even if we practice Tantra with much hardship, it will be like we're attaining these unfortunate states rather than attaining Buddhahood. So verse 109 says a Tantra, a person who is fond of despising and blaming their path showing guru, may try the highest tantric practice, abandoning dullness, sleep, and distractions, again, going through great hardship. It's as if they were practicing for the realms of woe. Because all of it, if we're doing it without the juice of our dedication to our gurus and our, kind of being properly relying upon them, we're only creating the causes for more misery. The remaining ones are actually three of the remaining ones are talked about in verse 110, and then we get to the final one in verse 111. If one is without respect for one supreme guru, first, virtues will not arise, and those arisen will decay. That's the first disadvantage, that kind of the progress we've made will decline, and the realizations and progress that we want to make will not arise. The next one, in this life comes sickness, untimely death, and so on. We will be afflicted by these physical states that are a product of turning away from the gurus as well, creating that unhealthy pattern with them. Thirdly, in future lives, endless wandering in realms of woe. So, not just in this life will we be afflicted by all these sufferings. In our future lives, we will end up in these unfortunate states. So then we go on to verse 111 with the final of these eight disadvantages. It says, if by some fluke one does find a happy rebirth, in spite of having not relied properly on the guru, because you will eventually have that. I mean, you're not damned for all time kind of thing. You just, when that karma has worn away, then you will get a happy rebirth. But through the result, like the cause of disrespect, one is born in the leisureless states and never hears even the words holy dharma or spiritual friend. Remember how we talked about how we create a karma that is similar to the result that we experience. So if you create a karma of relying properly on the guru, then gurus will keep appearing in your lives. If you create a karma that's disrespect for the gurus, well, then they won't appear in your lives. You've created some block to that. And that will take some time for that karma to wear off for you to eventually, hopefully, attain a good rebirth where you can access your gurus. So these are serious disadvantages to our misbehavior, our inappropriate devotion, or reliance upon the guru. And we're going to talk more about what all that means next week. But for now, again, if you can at least over the next week try to meditate a little bit on these, maybe read up a little bit on these topics and the Lamrim texts that you do have access to. Here's the summary in verses 112 and 113, and then we'll conclude for tonight. In short, if the way one adheres to one's guru is wrong, one will wander forever. Again, it says forever. Don't take that literally. It means just for an incredibly long time, tasting only suffering in samsara in general, woeful realms in particular, meaning these unfortunate states such as an animal and hell being and what have you, with no chance of gaining high rebirth or liberation. Since such benefits and disadvantages transcend thought, they're inconceivable, and the roots of my good collections are seen here too, unless thoughts of faults no longer cross my mind, I am certainly not adhering with faith and devotion. So we want to try to eliminate as much as possible our thoughts that interfere with seeing the gurus in the most positive light. And what I'm going to go into at the beginning of next week is before we get into the verses that kind of extend from this, that talk about what it means to actually rely properly on our gurus. I want to talk about the 10 qualities that we are ideally looking for in our Mahayana gurus. If we do correct kind of guru shopping, then hopefully we find somebody that we feel very good about our relationship with, and we never have a problem with these mistakes because we've checked them up. We know that there's somebody who is reliable that we feel good about relying upon. And hopefully that's the outcome for all of us here and anyone listening to these teachings, that you will have that kind of wonderful experience with a guru who you admire, who makes your heart. I know there's this term root guru. This is kind of a special guru who plays this very central role. Lama Yeshe, apparently, this is according to Venerable Connie Miller, Lama Yeshe used to say the root guru is the teacher who makes your heart explode, kind of gives you those teachings that make you just really open up to the Dharma. And so this is ideally what we're looking for. So don't get too down on these sort of disadvantages. Know that if we've done our work properly and we understand what correct reliance means, then hopefully we have somebody that we can have that type of trusting relationship with. And we can actually use it well and attain great realizations and progress on our path without any hitches, without any of these disadvantages even coming into play. Nonetheless, it's helpful to kind of, just like we read the warning sign on our medicine before we take it, it's good to read the warning sign on this because the guru is such powerful medicine and such a powerful part of our practice. It's good to be aware of the great benefits as well as the detriments. Okay, so again, if you can reflect on these verses, we'll have some, again, resources that you can check out that I'll put that list together and make sure that the link to that list is where different Lamrim texts are that you can study in addition to this. But I would encourage you in the week between to try to meditate on it, but also do some study on these topics. As I said, I can't go through, in some sections I'll be able to do maybe verse by verse and a commentary at least on some part of it. But it's going to be very difficult with the time that we have to go into the much greater detail on these topics, which again, and especially in something like Lama Tsongkhapa's great treatise, you'll have an opportunity for that type of investigation. Any questions to conclude tonight or comments? Yes, Ruth, please.
Well, does your guru have to be someone that's human, that's existing now, and or can it be someone that you know, like Tsongkhapa had Manjushri? I mean, or how do you have a guru if nobody's in the same town that you're in? Or
Yeah, these are challenges of our times, right? Where yes, the Dharma is disseminated more widely than it ever has, as I mentioned tonight, but our gurus are sometimes a bit sparse, and trying to find those beings who can play that role for us can be a bit of a challenge. I'm going to talk a little bit about that next week, and again, what we're ideally looking for, and maybe even some advice about how do we go about that process of finding beings who are candidates, if you will, for being our gurus. But there is benefit certainly to bringing to mind, like I know when I first met this tradition, I didn't meet Lama Yeshe, who was the founder. And when I read Lama Yeshe's teachings or see videos of him, I feel like there's something there that I really admire and feel close to. And his incarnation now, Osalhita, I've met him, but it's not quite the same spark. It's kind of interesting, different appearances, even though it's the same kind of essence. And so I think there is some benefit to seeing beings who are in the past, the Buddha himself, or these other beings, Manjushri, Green Tara, whoever it is, as manifestations of that in our lives. But nonetheless, I think we do need a physical embodied being who can actually give us tantric empowerment, for example, when we get to that level of practice, or give us the bodhisattva vows at the Mahayana level of practice, or give us the individual liberation vows at that level of practice, or somebody who, again, can give us the teachings directly through that living, breathing being there to kind of receive those. And sometimes we might have to go outside of our immediate neighborhood to find those. And so it might mean getting on planes and going to check out various teachers. But maybe in this day and age, we can check those teachers out initially by just looking at videos of them. His Excellence Ling Rinpoche, who was one of His Holiness's teachings in the prior life, his reincarnation is touring the U.S. right now, going to various centers and what have you. Going to be in California for, I don't know, about a month or something, doing various events. Sometimes it does mean we have to, they often have that phrase, right? When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Well, that doesn't mean, you wait for a knock at your door, sitting in your home, just saying, well, where's the teacher? And I'm waiting for them to show up. We might have to go check them out. We might have to do things to get in their presence, especially given the hugeness of this world. If you were in Tibet, 100 years ago, before the Chinese occupation, and the richness of the culture and all the lamas that were there, maybe you could find a lama in every town that played some sort of role in helping people in their spiritual practice, even though it might have been quite limited for lay people in Tibet. But nonetheless, that's not the situation that we're in, right? There aren't lamas in every town. And so we have to be a little more adventurous, a little more getting out of our our immediate environs and kind of seeking those beings, perhaps. But we can check them up. That's what I want to talk about a little bit next week, is kind of check up gurus, and we can do that through YouTube videos and through other teachings and books, and kind of see what we think about the beings who are out there on the sort of guru circuit, if you will. Again, from their side, they're just out there as a resource. It's up to us to make the determination to accept them as our guru. And oftentimes it involves them accepting us too. And that's a nice thing for them to know, that we're looking at them through that lens of being our guru, so that they then can play a more central role in our spiritual development. But at this time, when you're just checking up and trying to find it, you don't have to enter into that relationship too quickly. It's better to take your time and really feel confident that whoever it is that you've chosen is in a good position to play that role for you, and that you feel confident from your side that you can uphold what we're going to talk about next week, that kind of proper reliance. So there's no easy answer to this, but that's part of it, is to recognize that, yes, we're not in a day and age where the gurus are everywhere and we just decide, oh, I think I'll take that one, and I think I'll take that one, and they're right there outside our home or something. Instead, we have to perhaps put in a little more effort. It's just the karma that we live with in this day and age. So I wish I had an easier answer to that question, but I'll again go into it a little bit more next week. Any
hey,
other questions? Thank you, Ruth, for that. Anything else then?
well,
Or
what? So can you have more than one guru? Do you just
ab-
have?
Yeah, absolutely. It said that Lama Atisha had 200 and some, I don't know what it was, but he had like three he considered in that category of kind of being root gurus. And the root guru, again, is the one that really you feel is most influential due to the karma you have with that being. It really helps you greatly on your spiritual path. But he had many beings he considered to be gurus. We'll go into that maybe a little bit, though. I might mention one of the books that is really useful. It's huge, so you're not going to be able to read this before like next week unless you have a lot of free time. Is a book that was published by Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archives of Rinpoche's teachings on Guru devotion called The Heart of the Path. And you can access even bits of this going to the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archives website. Um, as I go through this, I'm only going to be able to direct you to some other things that are much more in depth. But if you look at this, I don't know how many hundreds of pages this is in terms of the text. It's 420 some 430 pages of writing about this topic that I'm only going to cover in what, a session and a half or something. So know that there's a lot more advice and information and how to work with this. And Rinpoche's teachings are always so wonderful and organized quite well in that volume, at least. Maybe as I go through this, I'll try to, put those resources, get them to Colleen, and she can send them out with that follow-up email or whatever after the teaching. So got lots on my list to do as well. So, all right. Any other comments or questions before we conclude? We're a bit over, but okay, well, I appreciate everyone's interest in engaging in this text, and I hope that I can do it justice in the teachings I'm sharing with you. Let's do our dedication prayers, uh, kind of sealing, as we said, that seventh limb of the practice is sealing our merits, our virtuous energy, our positive energy, so that it brings forth the results that we seek. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Then this verse said, encouraging us to kind of make our bodhicitta, this wish to become a Buddha for the sake of others, kind of grow and develop and not decline in the least. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then we'll do the prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for his good health and long life, for all his holy wishes to be fulfilled. As we recite that verse, think that we're creating the causes for all of our gurus, and even those that we haven't met with, who are out there kind of waiting in the wings for us to find them, for them to have good health and long lives, so we can eventually make those connections and devote ourselves properly to their advice. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And I realize I'm keeping you here just a little bit later, but let's do these 4 verses that are written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama for the swift return of our spiritual director, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings, through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from mother living beings you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the 3 jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Okay. So make sure there's nothing just a thank you in the chat box. Well, you're very welcome. And thank you all again for being here tonight. So we'll resume again next Tuesday. And if you do have questions in the meantime, please pass them along to Colleen and she'll get them to me. And if I feel like they can be answered directly to you, I'll do that. Otherwise, certainly we might hold on to them until the next class and address them there in the larger audience with everyone else. So. All right, everyone, be well. So good to be with all of you again. I really appreciate the opportunity. And thank you,
Thanks,
Colleen,
John.
for all your support.
John.
Okay. All right, everyone, be well. We'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome. All right, bye-bye.